Top of the middle of the day to you, good boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop for another little narrative session, and today, for your viewing pleasure, we're going to compare and contrast a Husqvarna 562 XP, which is going to be referred to a lot as me, to a 550 Husqvarna XP as well. This is going to be referred to as mini-me or mini. I'll throw the disclaimers out. This will be a long and tedious narrative unless you're a knuckle/gearhead similar to myself. The other part of that equation, I'm going to try to pull all this information out of the depths of my cranium. Please forgive me if and or when I slur and or stammer my speech. I call that slammering. Check the description for any qualifications or corrections that I might find. My email address is located at the bottom of the description in a lot of videos. You can check that out if you're interested in some custom saw modifications. Shooting me an email is the best way to start the process. So, back on track to what is actually the fun part of the equation. Outwardly on the bench, looking at them fully assembled, they look really close. If you're looking at them from a distance, be hard-pressed to tell. You'd have to be checking out one thing in particular, and that would be the differential between the shape of the back of the cylinder cover and air cleaner cover combo. They do have this nice little plastic insert, makes them look pretty tough, I think, but you can see we have a different shape to it on the 550 versus the 562. The 562 has a much bigger air cleaner, which makes sense. It's a bigger saw, 60 cc's. The 550 comes in at 50 cc's. If you do the reverse math situation, 43 millimeter piston in the 550 comes out to be a 34 millimeter stroke, I believe it is. If you take a look at the 46 millimeter piston in the 562, that equates to a 36 millimeter stroke in that particular saw, which Husky seems to run longer strokes. I actually kind of like a little bit longer stroke. Usually you get a little bit more low-end grunt out of the process. Both of these saws have nice long rods, I noticed. We'll talk about that later. One thing I did try to do is put the 562 cylinder up in here, and it actually touches. The other thing we're going to talk about, we have some reliefs since like the early version 562s. You can see they didn't actually have the little relief in the side for passing air like the later versions have. These saws have a tendency to run hot. We're going to have to actually relieve that for that gentleman when we get ready to do that saw. But anyway, back on track. Think about the concept. You take the body of a torch, you stab the throttle on the back, which is basically the air circuit, adds a bunch of oxygen, oxyacetylene torch. That's how you get your cutting effect. If you want like magnum heat, we have the same kind of a concept going on with these saws. All the stratification style engine designs, you're actually dealing with a controlled air leak, if you will. We're actually having raw air come into the circuit. It's trying to create a barrier. You're essentially stuffing a little bit of raw air back into the end of the transfer port circuit, creating a barrier so that it takes longer for the actual charge to get out, and hopefully in concept less is going out into the atmosphere. If you think about the concept of adding raw air, the controlled air leak concept in a way, these saws have a tendency to run really hot as well. We're seeing a lot of the tolerance numbers come in way over 3 thousandths, which any saws up before this style of engine, you're kind of looking at that as a throwaway option, unless you can come up with a piston that's 1.5 thousandths or so bigger in diameter. With these new saws, they come out of the box that way. We'll talk about the piston design a little bit more as we go along, but we kind of segued off into what's actually happening internally. We'll get back on track. We'll look at the recoil assembly cover, pull starter cover, if you will. You can see they're pretty much the exact same design. only smaller on Mini. Using the same pulley concept. I would imagine they have the same spring in there as well. Makes perfect sense. Economies of scale. You're not completely redesigning every new horse. You're kind of utilizing what you have available. If we look at the air cleaners for a minute, the early version 562s actually came with a nylon version, and they were passing a lot of particulates. They started warrantying them. That went on for a while, 6 months, 8 months, or whatever, maybe a year, I don't know. Then they started fitting them with the flock version. Does a lot better job. You can see this nylon one's passing some fine dust through there. I've actually ordered the flock version for the 562 for this particular gentleman, so when he gets it back after we work on it a little bit, it won't be sucking a bunch of crap through. And you can see the opening same shape, just a little smaller, but it's the same concept of the design anyway. If we look at the air horns themselves, they look like they're carbon copies, and for the most part they are. What we're dealing with, same switch actuation concept, and switch lever itself, the primer bulb, the whole process is exactly the same except for the size of the opening. If we want to take the 550 version and we want to look at the 562 carburetor assembly, and we go, oh, it fits right on there, like exactly. I did notice that the bolts that hold the air horn on are the same. You can see that it fits right on there. Interesting concept. So there's not a lot of difference between the air horns or the velocity stacks. Zama carburetors, you can see they're relatively close to the same. Just the orifices for the fresh air circuit's a little smaller in a 550 version. Zama carburetors, and you can see on the where it first starts the circuit for the stratification process, a little bit more open on the 562, a little bit bigger venturi on the 562. You can see that the butterfly takes a while for it to actually open. You got about 20 degrees or so before it starts to open the shutter on the fresh air circuit. I thought that was interesting. Maybe that's why they struggle a little bit. If we look at the intake manifold, same design, just a little bit smaller. It's a little bit more narrow. Obviously, we're dealing with a little bit more narrow cylinder. If we look at the cylinders themselves, fin configuration's virtually the same. A little bit more surface area on the 562. They're running a little bit more up there temperature-wise, if you consider it's a bigger engine, 10 cc's or so. If we look at the back and you see where the start of the intake circuit, they got the same basic shape, relatively close to the same shape for the fresh air circuits. They're relatively close to the same height. Flange is quite a bit bigger on the 562 though. If we look at the transfer ports themselves, same kind of concept. If we look at the exhaust, this would be Me and Mini-Me. It's just a little bit smaller in Mini-Me, a little bit different shape, but not much. One thing I will make note of is it's actually the distance from front to back on the 562 is less than the distance front to back on the 550. I thought that was interesting. I like this design, how it's recessed in here. There's more distance for the charge to transition from the open cavity down into the transfer ports. They're square, about 12.5 millimeters or so. 562, they're oblong. They're about 14 by about 12.5. But anyway, like I said, I like this design better. The transition isn't as abrupt as what we see in the 562. I have no idea why this cylinder is bigger, and it's the distance-wise, other than we're trying to keep the saw short. If we look at the pistons, 43 versus 46 millimeters, but you can see they're It's carbon copy. One thing I noticed is they're a little more thick in the back than in the front. The still versions are just the opposite. They look similar to this in design, except they're a 2-ring design, in like say the 362, which is the same concept as the 562. That 60cc class saw. One thing I noticed that the skirts are a lot longer on the Husqvarnas. They don't seem to have the same kind of problem with ghosting. I'm kind of wondering if that's part of the equation. There's some other things we're going to have to deal with ghosting here one of these days heavily. But anyway, the fresh air comes in the back of the reliefs as it rolls down through bottom dead center. Then it closes off the circuit for the fresh air that comes in, and it's trying to essentially stuff it into the end of the transfer port circuits. Interesting concept. If we look underneath, we can see there's a lot of area right here where we can actually be pushing the charge to pressurize the crankcase. They have these little gussets in both of them. You're not going to get as much flow coming out from underneath the dome as fast. Might end up helping them cool a little bit, but you can see we have little flat spots there where we actually can push the charge, which I thought was interesting. If we look at the wrist pins, they're the same 10 millimeter size and diameter, same bearings. I wish it was a little bit bigger in the 562. The 362, for example, runs a 12 millimeter pin and a little bit bigger bearing. This piston will take a 288, which is 54 millimeters in diameter, obviously a lot bigger. That actually weighs less. It weighs 2 grams less than the 562 piston. As an example, the 562 is about 2 grams heavier than the 362 as well. Just some interesting things that I noticed because I'm curious, I guess. Same basic concept. There's a tube that's inside. It has holes in it that lets the exhaust come out of the tubes in different locations around on the inside. And then inside the cavity, then there's a little tube that's about this long that's welded in the bottom underneath. Well, it's the top, I guess, on the bottom of where this is called the exhaust outlet. Underneath the exhaust outlet, a little tube runs down in there, so the exhaust goes in, has to disperse, and then has to collect again and then come through the tube. I don't know if they're trying to get like a pipe effect. If we look at one thing that I thought was pretty interesting in these mufflers, we can see there's a hole right off the bat that goes into the main cavity, but then the rest of it has to travel down in the tube. There's actually one small hole in the 562 right there. If we look in the 550, same kind of hole concept, but there's actually 2 bigger holes. They're actually bigger than the lower single hole in the 562 that lets that exhaust escape a little bit quicker. Thought that was interesting. A little more narrow, about 10 millimeters or so. If we look at the nuts and bolts of this operation, we can see they're both sporting the new. Everything seems to be going to the 10 millimeter spark plug. They both have that. This is the exhaust gasket off the 550. You can see that it's not much smaller than what we see. It's just at a different location than what we see on the 562, but it's overall not that much smaller of an opening. The only real difference, they use the same screws holding down the carburetor. Same bolts holding down the cylinder, same spacers, same kind of concept. It just has a little bit bigger bolts on the 562 holding the top of the muffler down, but they're using all kinds of same kind of concept spacer-wise. They both use an aluminum cooling plate, fiber muffler gasket. If we want to look in at the crankcases themselves, they're both the full circle crank variety. Technically full circle, they're really caps, they're metal caps. They actually have some nylon pieces that are designed to fit in there, wrap around the top of the crankshaft, I guess, kind of butt up against the throws right there, kind of where the journal area is, upper part of the throws technically. But you can see how we're trying to pressurize this area, what the full circle cranking concept does is it takes up volume, so your pumping ratio increases, helps them run better, which is a nice feature. Actually helps them be more efficient as well. But you can see how we're directing the flow underneath and how it comes up through. That's the start of the transfer port circuit. Metal flywheel, auto tune. So we have 2 magnets on the crank that are they're used to monitor the speed of the crank. That's how we're metering the fuel. If we look in at the 562, same basic design, same 2 magnets on the same metal flywheel concept. We call this, like I said, a full circle crank, but they're metal caps with some nylon pieces that are molded to fit inside there that butt up against the bottom of the throws, come around on the top. But they both have nice long rods for what we're dealing with, which is sweet. The longer the rod, the better your dwell time is. We kind of talked about that before. We want to get back on the fresh air concept for a minute. We'll talk about this is the reason this used one came in. We have like a problem with the piston meltdown. You can see we have seizure issues on the back, not where the charge is coming in, only where the fresh air is coming in. That's why I'm always harping on mix oil with these new saws that have sloppy tolerances. You want a mix oil that has a good density to resist being crushed, since the tendency, you want to talk about rotation. The engine rotates, obviously the piston's going up and down, but there's centripetal force. It's trying to stuff that piston up against the front of the cylinder wall. You want to have a good density oil to help prevent it from being crushed. That'll help the piston slap, if you will. The other part of the equation is they're running really hot, so you want a good mix oil that has a high film strength or a high viscosity number. That's going to help combat the heat issue, because thermal breakdown is essentially what happens. The hotter it gets, the oil becomes more fluid-like, and it begins to run more and more, and to the point where it actually will burn. So you want a high flash point number, in my humble opinion anyway. Running a air-cooled engine like this, you want a high number for the viscosity to combat that thermal breakdown in the oil. Just, that's my interpretation. Segueing back onto what we're talking about at hand, I did check out quite a little bit if it would be possible to put the 562 top end on the 550. One of the things, we got a 2 millimeter shorter stroke, which is going to kind of be an issue. We have a much bigger diameter flange. You're going to have to machine the cases out in the 550. There's a lot of things that are cool. Conceptually, I don't know if the coil would handle it, if you'd have to switch that out or not. I haven't checked into it that deeply, but you could probably somehow retrofit the small muffler on there to go with the way it's mounted on the cases on the 550, excuse me. Just interesting side notes. Maybe doable, but certainly costly. Here, if we look at the base gaskets, they're both a fibrous style. If we look at the 550, which is on top, you can actually see how it's just a little bit longer than the 550. I thought that was really interesting. Another thing that I noticed, this is the clutch cover off the 550. For the most part, it'll fit on here. Mates up with the process of the chain brake, but the problem is the location of the pin that for the chain tensioner. It's a little bit higher up the way it's designed in the 550, so it doesn't mate up with the cases. It's actually a little bit more short, but it's not that far off, which I thought was an interesting side note. Yeah, seems like we have plenty of time with this operation. So weight-wise, they're relatively close, 12 or so. I don't know, it comes in at 10.5 or something like that. So they're a little bit of different weight. I know I've production cut with a 562 that's been insane-wise. They'll pull a 28-inch bar with pretty good authority. If you wanted to reshape the combustion chamber, that saw would be pretty much a force to be reckoned with a 28. If you wanted to do something like that situation on a 550, now you're talking pulling a 24 like it's an animal. It'd probably be a pretty good little arborist operation. And from what I can tell, you could run little short bars, run some pretty decent long bars. If you had to chunk a little bit bigger stuff down, you wouldn't want to be using your top handle on. So pretty good operation. There's some things that we'd like to see be maybe a little bit different. Overall, pretty good platform, both of them. We're on about the third or fourth fuel map in the 562. They run actually really good at this point. Like I think I mentioned, they ovalized the exhaust, changed the shape of it a little bit in the 550. In the later version cylinders, that kind of helps that process along as well. But overall, pretty decent little saws. And I think we've kind of covered the whole process here. So I'm thankful that you took this time to watch. And wherever you might be on God's green earth, I'm hoping that you have a blessed day.